Coming. Okay. Hello, I'm here today with Robert Boyd. Nowadays, mostly writes about art online, and I'll let him explain that in just a second. But I came to know his name because I was a diehard reader of the Comics Journal, and he was a longtime contributor. And he contributed to the Comics Journal's Top 100. Of course, I'm not don't have my magazine sitting next to me, of course. Robert's got it. He's on it. And so that issue has fascinated me ever since it came out. I made an issue of my own zine devoted to it. And Robert was kind enough to answer a few questions and now kind enough to come on here and talk to me about it. So, Robert, why don't we first off tell people where they can find your writing nowadays?
Well, mostly it's on my newsletter. It's a Substack newsletter called "The Great God Pan is Dead." The name comes from a monologue by William Burroughs that I heard back in the 80s and has always stuck in my head for some reason. Mm-hmm. It has nothing to do with the subject matter, though. I have to admit, it's not like I'm talking about Greek mythology here. Mm-hmm. It's mostly just anything about culture at large that I'm interested in. A lot of it's visual art, but a lot of it's comics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm always I'm fascinated whenever you're writing about the local Houston art scene, but I'll admit I'm a comics troglodyte. I'm always just like, oh, comics. So, and especially when you take a trip, those are always very fascinating to me, hearing about some company that you worked for in the 90s, not just Fantagraphics, but you did you worked for Roger Corman, I believe, at one point. You self-published, I believe.
I did, and I still do, every now and then.
Mm-hmm.
I worked for Dark Horse Comics after Fantagraphics. I worked for Fantagraphics. That was my first comics job. And after that, I worked for Dark Horse Comics for a little over a year. Then Roger Corman was starting his own comic book company, and a friend of mine was asked to be the editor, and he recommended me for the job, and I took it and managed to spend a whole bunch of Roger Corman's money until he finally realized, hey, I'm losing a fortune on this.
Yeah,
that's not what I do, and he fired us. And then I went and worked for Kitchen Sink for a while. Then I had the extreme bad luck to work for CrossGen. It was a fun work environment, but it was a terrible company.
Yeah.
And then I kind of got out of the comics biz because the comics biz was swirling the drain at that point.
Yeah. Did you, for CrossGen, did you have to move down to Florida or wherever it was? Yeah.
Actually, Tampa's a pretty bleak place in some ways, but it was very lovely to live there.
Okay, that's great. Wow. I hope you write about that sometime. I would love to read about that experience.
I don't necessarily have a lot to add to the cross story.
Yeah. All right. Well, I won't get too sidetracked by CrossGen. So Fantagraphics was your first industry. Did you have history with the Comics Journal or Fantagraphics before that?
I had started reading the Comics Journal. I guess I was in college when I started picking it up, and was super intrigued because I was a hardcore fan of alternative comics, and the only way you could find out about them was by reading something like the Comics Journal, because it was a tiny, isolated corner of the entire comics business, which itself is tiny and isolated. Yeah. So I started in college, and then I went and worked overseas for a while. And while I was working overseas, I figured, the Comics Journal wasn't like art form. It wasn't like a big, fancy, glossy magazine. It was barely above a fanzine. I figured, you know what? I bet I could write for them. So I wrote a review. I literally wrote a review while sitting on a ship in the middle of just off of the coast of Brazil about I can't remember what I wrote it for, and I sent it in a blind submission, and then a few weeks later, the mail was delivered to my ship, and I was a published author with the Comics Journal, and so I kept writing every now and then.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, when I moved back to the United States, I almost immediately was offered a job as a journalist for them. They wanted someone to be to write news stories because they did a lot of comics industry news, and I was not skilled as a journalist. I was a terrible journalist, very shy, which is the worst thing you can be. You don't want to be shy and call someone up and say, "Hey," and you start. Have you stopped beating your wife yet? Or you know, some embarrassing question, like calling up. There were lots of like scandals in the comics industry in those days, and I hated calling up someone and ask them to comment about something horrible that their company had just done. But that was the job of a journalist for the Comics Journal, to be willing to do that, and I was bad at it. And I was surprisingly, they didn't fire me on the spot, but they shifted my workload to be general editorial assistant for whatever needed doing, both on the Comics Journal, because aside from the journalism part of the journal, there's a lot of little details that have to be completed for an issue to go to the press. And this was back in the days before desktop publishing. So an issue going to press was physical boards with what each page looked like laid out, sometimes with overlays for halftones and stuff, FedEx to a printer someplace that would then photograph and make printing plates out of those boards. We had a typesetting machine, which I learned to use, and I transcribed, it seems like hundreds of interviews, but probably there's only a few dozen. And that was a really tedious job, but it was something that we had to do. The Comics Journal was very much influenced by Playboy, so interviews were pretty much the main thing in every issue. And someone had to transcribe all those interviews.
Yeah. That's fantastic. When did you become a columnist, and how did that become?
I was working for Fantagraphics, the publisher as a whole, as an editor, and one of the things I did was I looked at all the submissions, because if you work for a publisher, most submissions you get over the transom are not ready for publication. And some of them are terrible, but some of them are pretty good. But you have to make a judgment on everything, and you have to read everything. And we would get mini comics a lot of the time, self-published comic books. And I was seeing some that were good, that were entertaining in and of themselves, but maybe not quite enough for us to publish them. And I was thinking, man, it seems like a waste that these people spent time making these mini comics, and they are totally gone the second they finish them, because there wasn't much of a network for mini comics back then. There was a magazine called Fact Sheet 5, which was a review magazine for zines. Each issue had like literally thousands of like one-sentence reviews, and that was the only way to get information about mini comics, pretty much. This was before the internet was a big deal. So I said, hey, we should have a column about mini comics, because these people will be great cartoonists someday, and we need to know about them, and the rest of the world needs to know about them now. That was my thinking, was let's introduce people to these great, mostly young cartoonists. And that's how it started.
Yeah, that's a great idea. So when the time came to do a top 100 list in 1999, Was I think his title was executive editor at that point. And he kept the pool small. It was just TCJ columnists, and you were one of them. And it ends up being 8 people who made lists. Eric Reynolds, who at the time was the PR guy. What was his? He was the paid shill company.
He was the marketing director, but yeah, he had a self-deprecating view of it.
Yeah. Yeah, he told me he had business cards with that on it, so I'm not telling anything out of school. But it was decided that they would exclude his list because, in a PR capacity, and Bob Fiore, a longtime columnist, decided he didn't want to do it. Though I think he might have regretted that decision based on his letters to the Journal afterwards. He seemed to really enjoy the final product. So you and 7 other people made lists. Do you recall anything about Tom Spurgeon reaching out to you about this project and what time?
Honestly, I don't really remember how it came about, or even how it was proposed, or whether it was proposed on whether he sent an email or whether he said something on the Comics Atlas. I don't know. I can't remember.
You mentioned the Comics Atlas there. That was before my time of paying attention to anything, and I don't know that I would have been able to get on there anyway. Can you just describe what that was and what function it served for everybody?
Early on in the internet age, the World Wide Web didn't really exist. There were email servers, and the only way to have communication with a lot of people had a shared interest. This was before Facebook or anything like that. Was through these mailing lists. Is a piece of software that would forward any email you made, to everyone else on the list. And so someone, I can't remember who, it might have been Martin Evans, it might have been I'm not really sure who. Someone decided to make a list of alternative comics hardcore fans. So there were people like me, Bart Beatty, and so on, and so and it was, I think it was invitation only, but I can't really remember because it's been a long, long time. So it was a way for us to just discuss what was happening in the world of alternative comics and have critical dialogue, which was important to us.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So you made a list. When you answered the questions I sent you, you pretty much said, I just went through my library and made a list, which I find very interesting. I mean, sounds like some people really labored over it, and some people, you're on the opposite end where you just kind of was like, this is today's list, tomorrow's would be different. So what did you think about that exercise?
I don't have a strong memory, but I just remember going through books like this and just picking out my favorites.
Sure.
This is the Smithsonian book of newspaper comics, which I consider one of the greatest books of comics ever published. So I knew what I liked, and I just thought I'd do that. I didn't really think deeply about what's the artistic significance of every little item on my list. I didn't think that stuff until a final list was compiled and we were assigned the task of writing about them. So a list is kind of a lazy thing to do, but writing about something requires some thought.
Fair enough. And you wrote about half a dozen of those entries? Yeah. Do you remember how those were assigned at all, or did you get to request something?
Yeah, I think we requested something, because I think the ones I ended up writing about were ones that I liked a lot, like Alec and Jaime Hernandez works and so on. but I think some were just assigned. I think perhaps Spain was assigned to me. Spain's autobiographical comics.
Okay.
But I don't really know. I can't remember exactly how that happened, to be honest.
Yeah. That was an area that I worked on this thing for a really long time, and I mean, not in the grand scheme of things, but for me, it was the longest I've worked on something, and I tried to think of everything I could, and as soon as I said, okay, I'm just done with it. We need to just print it and be done with it. It did occur to me, like, damn it, there where people wrote about these things, and perhaps I could have gotten a few more insights if I had contacted, because they had people write about the entries that didn't make lists. There, were I forget how many, but 15, 20 people wrote entries, more than just the 8 who made the list. So that was a whole aspect of the list that is interesting to me, that it never really occurred to me that someone had to generate these wonderful essays, and they're sort of uniformly wonderful. They're great. Great introductions to great works.
Well, what I liked about doing them, and this is important because it affects me right now, is that being able to step back and write about something that you already know is great means that you have a different kind of perspective than if you're reviewing something, like a book review, where you read the book once and it was important to you for that minute, and then you write a review and that's it. But here, if I'm writing about Alex by Eddie Campbell, I've read that a lot, and I've thought about it as art, as autobiographical fiction, as I thought about it in a lot of different ways. And so to get to write about it again years after it's been published allows me to think thoughts about it that I hadn't really thought about before. Mm-hmm. What I might call mature thoughts that have had time to simmer in my brain for the past few years.
Yeah.
And because I was living with this again when I reread Canon, it reminded me how much I enjoyed writing those essays, and that consequently I decided to start writing 100 comics for my library for The Great God Pan Is Dead, which I've been doing the past few months.
Yeah, I want to get to that after we talk about this stuff. So, do you remember what your reaction was when you got the issue? Or I guess first of all, you must have known some things that were on the list because you were assigned to write them. Seen the list before the issue came out?
I think I must have, but I don't really remember seeing it.
Okay. And do you remember what your reaction was to the final issue?
I loved it, obviously. I mean, I'm sitting here lovingly clutching a 25-year-old magazine that I have. I love this Seth cover, especially. It was a highly readable feature. This is exactly what you want to be in the Comics Journal, is this kind of thing. And while certainly there were disagreements with specific things on the list and specific philosophical issues, like having multiple entries for Jaime Hernandez, for example, that are tricky and understandably less kind of a bad feeling. I didn't mind that much. To me, what I thought of it is this was his first step, and that if they were like Sight and Sound, they'd do this every 5 years or something, but they haven't.
Yeah,
it was a good idea, but they didn't do it.
Yeah, you mentioned Sight and Sound, and that is something that you had that critique at the time, and then you had the same critique when I asked you 25 years later, was that it would have been better to have maybe expanded the pool of list makers. Is that I don't know if you saw in the the canon issue, I mean, Tom Spurgeon does kind of explain why he didn't do that. He wanted a sort of journal centric list, but is that something you would have preferred to have seen still, a wider?
Yeah, but I understand. Let's put ourselves in Tom Spurgeon's shoes. Doing this with just 8 people is an extreme labor. It is really hard. Doing it with 500 critics would have been impossible. No way.
Yeah.
And the fact that Sight and Sound could do it even is amazing. And they clearly have more resources than the Comics Journal had, but not that much more.
Mm-hmm.
And also, it would have been hard to find like 500 really skilled comics critics, and it would have been hard to find them who speak English.
Yes.
The best critics of comics are in other countries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's pretty much what Gary Groth said to me, was that, I don't, there, outside of the journal, there wasn't a whole lot going on in English for us to pluck from. I mean, it's a fine point. I'm sure they could have found quite a few people, especially if they've been academics and such, but the journal was kind of where it was at for any kind of critical writing in a magazine.
If you think about the situation now versus then, now you could find that many academics. You could find 500 worldwide academics and critics for comics. Back then, it would have been really hard, and the labor of actually compiling it would have been so difficult. And keep in mind, Sight and Sound doesn't just do critics and academics; it also does practitioners. So they would, to match Sight and Sound, they would have had to create 2 lists, one by cartoonists and one by critics and academics, which would have been, the labor involved would have been, it's hard to imagine how hard that would have been.
Yeah. All of you that weren't in the office, so you, Charles Hatfield, Bart Beatty, Ray Mescalado, R.C. Harvey, you all just submitted your list and that was it. Do you wish that there had been more of a follow-up debate? Presumably in the office, they were really hashing it out. Do you wish that they had included the list makers in that debate?
No, that's the editor's job. That's why you hire an editor to be.
Yeah.
You don't want to make the grunt workers have to labor on that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's a very healthy attitude. I got the impression that nobody was really upset about it, but that, maybe they expected a little more back and forth, or to have a little more of a voice later on. But like you said, it's it could have become kind of a logistical nightmare trying to have 8 different voices going back and forth.
And keep in mind that this is email had just barely begun at this time, so it wasn't like we had like super easy communication with everyone, and it was the labor involved was just too much for us to get involved. I'm glad I wasn't involved in that aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
But if I had been on staff at the Comics Journal, even as a editorial assistant, I would have inserted myself into the process somehow.
Yeah, for sure. That would be one of the perks of being there in the office, just to get your 2 cents in when you can.
A perk or a burden.
That's true. Yes. How did you feel about the final list? Obviously nobody had 100% of their choices on the list. That's why they're mixing the list. So how did you feel about the final version?
I mostly agreed with it. I can't think of like any obvious disagreements I had. Definitely there were things that I would have put on, but it's okay. I think everything on it probably deserved to be on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was when I decided to revisit that issue to make this issue of my zine. I that was what really struck me, was that the list really holds up well, even for comics that I don't care for, and don't have any particular affection for. There aren't any on there that I would argue aren't interesting and accomplished works, and that aren't representative of the 20th century. And I'm a little amazed they were able to walk that line so well.
The interesting thing to me is that if we were to make that list now, the amount of comics that have been produced since then that would make the list is pretty large.
Yeah.
Because basically, comics worldwide made a huge change in the 60s when suddenly the idea of comics as art became possible. And so for the past 50 years, more comics as art have been produced. And it's staggering, actually, how many good comics have been produced since this magazine came out.
Yeah.
It would be interesting to see what this list would look like now, how many things would drop off and how many new things would be added, things that have been published since this list was originally published.
Yeah. That was, the other side of the coin of that is actually something I wanted to ask you about, which is how many, just as a percentage, how much of the stuff on the original list do you think would drop off if they were making a new list? I mean, do you think
is a really tough question.
Yeah.
I think partly it would depend on if we had this exact same rules for inclusion, which they were really vague rules.
Sure.
And if we updated those rules, that would drop off some, just because authors with multiple entries would probably get sliced down somewhat. But I don't know. I don't know. I guess I would say maybe 25% would drop off and 25% new entries would be added.
Interesting. Yeah, especially some of the strips, I felt, and this isn't to take away from their quality at all. It's just, there aren't that many people who can read Barney Google. There's only been so many reprints. Polly and Her Pals, which was very high on the list, that hasn't gotten a ton of reprints, whereas something like Peanuts or Crazy Cat or Pogo, Popeye is now in its second go round in this century. It's third total, but they've in this century they're already in the second go round. So some of those I think really benefit. Gasoline Alley being reprinted by Drawn and Quarterly, I think really helped that strip get in front of people. I mean, who's talked about Little Abner in recent years, though? I mean,
admittedly, but Little Abner is a great strip, and but since Kitchen Sink finished reprinting them all, the demand for it has not really kept up.
Yeah. So I'm not trying to.
Little Abner dropped off. I wouldn't cry.
Yeah. That's how I feel about it too. I don't want to put you on the spot with specifics, but was there anything that you were a real champion of that you thought maybe should have been on the list?
I can't really remember.
Sure.
What I put on my personal list that didn't make it to the final list. Yeah. They were mostly foreign things because I misunderstood the instructions. I took the instructions to mean things that had been published in English. So even if they've been translated. So if we were to do this again, I would want all those to be on the list, but I probably would want many others as well. Yeah, I think that was a fault of the list, but an understandable one to limit it to English language original works.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's one of those that a lot of people take issue with, but they're not thinking about the logistics of that. And um, once again, when I talked to Gary Groth, he said, he's like, none of us had any sort of expertise on manga at all,
Okay.
and even the European work, I mean, it's only Kim Thompson was able to read, widely and deeply because he had so many languages. But he's like, the rest of us had to sort of rely on what reprints there were. They just didn't, he said he grudgingly went along with that stricture, but admitted, that he wouldn't have been any better off than anyone else if they had the wide palette to choose from. I was taking a look at your list, just a real quick look, and outside of the foreign material that was left off, I mean, a lot of your choices in the top, 40 or so are on the list.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
we all knew what was really important. And the fact is, every one of us would have offered up a very similar list.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at it, there's probably not that much difference between our lists.
Yeah. Do you now, here's a question. Do you think that's because of the availability of the material and how widely read you all were in that material? Or do you think that, as the critics of the journal would say, that there was a sort of insular comics journal view of comics?
I think there was definitely a comics journal view of comics. That's what you want from a critical magazine, to have a viewpoint.
Sure.
And all of us columnists bought into that viewpoint to a certain degree.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not really sure if there's a controversy there.
No. I don't have a problem with it, but I mean, obviously the critics of the journal always do have criticism. But then you get into distinctions of taste. Yeah.
Distinctions of taste is almost another way of saying the word criticism.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think... Sorry, go ahead, Robert.
We're all critics, so our tastes are our product. That's what we're selling to the public.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, R.C. Harvey, he addressed the so many Fantagraphics titles being on the list as saying, well, what do you expect? They think they're publishing the best comics, so clearly there's going to be a support for those. I mean, they wouldn't be publishing them if they didn't think they were great works. And that, to me, I don't even think the original count of Fantagraphics titles on the list is overwhelming. It is, since the issue was printed, they've now,
right, because Fantagraphics has reprinted so many of the classic EC comic strips, etc., that partly, in a way, this was used as a publishing program for the future of Fantagraphics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do wonder how much that occurred to them at the time. If that put anything on their radar that perhaps like a roadmap for us, sort of self-fulfilling prophecy.
I don't know if that was on anyone's mind, but it's useful to have a list of important works, because then you can decide whether or not something is worth researching or publishing based on whether or not it was included on that list. It's really important to have some sort of canon, as you would certainly agree, and that's important in any art form. And comics, up till then, utterly lacked it.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember much of a reaction at the time?
Let me put it this way:
Oh,
it
yeah.
lacked it lacked a written version, but the canon existed in the minds of certainly of all the columnists for the Comics Journal.
Sure. Do you remember much of a reaction at the time?
I remember discussing it vigorously on the Comics at Lib, but beyond that, I don't particularly remember a reaction.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the problems with a periodical magazine is that the next issue comes down the pike and everyone's on to the next thing. And I almost wonder that if this had been printed as a book, if maybe younger readers would be more familiar with it, if it's something they could find in a used bookstore, or because finding a random issue of the journal now is not, it's not as easy as it once was.
Maybe, but I think now in the world of the age of the internet, a book edition is totally unnecessary. I think what's important is to have a canon that people agree on, more or less, that exists somewhere that they can access either by a list on the internet or a magazine or whatever, that they can then use as a guide for their own personal explorations of whatever art form we're talking about, in this case, comics.
Yeah.
That's the best possible use for it, is that for people to be able to look at it and use it as a menu of things to try, of places to explore. And admittedly, a magazine, the instant it's published, it's a depreciated good. So a lot of people who could have benefited from this list certainly never saw it. But now they can see it easily online, right?
Yeah, you can find it. One, you have to know to look for it, I guess. That's one of the problems. But also, you can find the list pretty easily. Obviously, I Googled this stuff all over the place, just trying to find every commentary I could. But one thing you don't get when you find it online is you don't get all the wonderful that all of you wrote back then. You get the top 100 and you can get people on Reddit arguing about it. But you don't get you talking about Alec or Kim Thompson writing about Peanuts. And certainly for me as a young man, that was a really important thing to read all of those essays. I mean, there was a lot of those comics I either I hadn't heard of them, or I had heard of them, but I'd never read them, never seen them. And so sometimes for years, that was the only thing I had to go on was that little bit, and I would remember it. And if I would see something in a used bookstore or a reprint was coming, I would snatch it up because I remembered it from that issue. Yeah, I don't know. It was a great thing, not just for the list and for the arguing and the back and forth, but also just to engage with the writing you all did.
Oh, thank you. That. Like I said, that was the most pleasurable part for me, was writing my short essays on the various topics that I was assigned.
Yeah, I wish I'd been able to speak Spurgeon for about 100 reasons, but I would have loved to have known the process for choosing who did what essays, and kind of how that shook out, because they really did seem to be a perfect pairing of writer and subject across the board. Really a peak of his editorial tenure.
I'm going to suggest that if Tom was still alive, he would tell you, I have no idea how I assigned those. I can't remember. It was a long time ago.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah, I mean, it was the cap of his. It was, I think, the last issue he did, which makes it even more. Yeah, even more remarkable. That's kind of how he went out.
Makes it a kind of ideal issue then, because it is both. he's laying a marker for any future editor. Not that any future editor. I can't even name a future editor. I guess
Yeah.
Anna Elizabeth Moore was the editor for a
Yeah.
while.
She was. Yeah.
So that's a subsequent editor that I actually know the name of. But I don't really know anyone else, and I don't know who's running the journal now.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that important for me to know, even though it was quite important for me for a long time to have my finger on the pulse of the Comics Journal.
Yeah, especially when it was a sort of monthly publication, right? That everyone was engaging with on a regular basis.
Sort of monthly is a funny way to put it because it was never monthly.
Yeah.
I'm not sure there are any years where they actually got out 12 issues.
Yeah, I doubt it. When you look at those old, even just a regular issue, not a special issue of any kind, just a regular issue, it's astounding to me they exist. I mean, they're just there's a lot of work in those things. Labor of the people put them together is remarkable, and they're long. Like, I did this thing and it felt like a Herculean task for me, and then you go and look, and the actual issue that I'm writing about is longer than this. And
about a magazine like the New Yorker. They're basically putting out a comics journal every week. I can't even imagine that.
Yeah.
But they have huge staffs and well-oiled machines, and the comics journal was never well-oiled.
Yeah.
And believe me, there were times when I saw an entire issue of boards where basically the issue's laid out, all the stuff, thrown across the room by an art director and an editor. That I think that has probably never happened at the New Yorker, although it might have.
Yeah. After I issue, you were kind enough to write about it on your Substack, and a very nice piece, and you shared more of you kind of spoke about the issue in context, I guess. So you already wrote about this, and I highly encourage people to go check out your Substack, and not only read that, but just in general, read your writing. But I guess I wanted to, we've touched on this, but what are your feelings the issue now, 25 years later? I don't know. Do you have, revisit it over the years? Had you looked at it? Had you really given it any thought at all?
Not really. Okay. It's not to say it was, not worth revisiting, but, time passes and it becomes a part of history for me personally. When Canon came out, actually prior to Canon coming out, I didn't know what to think about it. I didn't even pull it out, I don't think, when prior to it coming out. But when it came out, I pulled it out, and the fact that you made a whole fanzine about it made me feel really proud of the work we had done. It made me feel like we weren't just screaming idly into the void. That's important.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Oh yeah, no, thank you. I made this thing thinking no one really will give a shit, but it's something I want to talk about, so I'm gonna do it anyway. And I've been surprised at, not that it's some bestseller or anything, but I've had more interest than I expected. I really thought, a few dozen people will pay attention to it, and more than a few dozen, but still not getting much past that. But for something as so niche and esoteric, heartened by it. Of course they tend to be in my demographic, and I don't expect young people to care about it, but I would love for them to see the original list and engage with that and argue about it. And, see what they like and don't like. It's a great list for that. It's not some unassailable monument.
Oh, that's unassailable.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I do want to add that the back and forth that you had with Alex Eklund,
Yeah.
that is what that is the ultimate culmination of the success of the issue, to have someone have that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
That this list provoked two people to think, to discuss deeply all those comics. What else could we want? If ideally, it'd be a lot of people, but
Yeah.
two is enough, really.
Yeah.
25 years later tells me that list had staying power.
I appreciate that very much. And
even if it is out of date now there should be a new one. Whether it's the Comics Journal or who else, or maybe the Billy Island Museum should host a list.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I know you still read comics, but they're not the focus of what you're doing for your living anymore. How interested would you be in a new list? Like, if you heard that was coming down the pike, how interested would you read that and to engage in it?
I would read it for sure. I don't think I'd necessarily be a good critic to ask to contribute to it, because I don't keep up with when the original list came out. I read almost every comic, except I didn't read them, Marvels and DCs and Images. I didn't read most of those, but
yeah,
of all the non-mainstream comics, I read them all. I certainly don't do that now. No one could do that now.
No, it's physically impossible. Sorry, go ahead, Rob.
I don't really feel obliged. I don't feel capable of producing a list that I feel encompasses the entire art form.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess that's true of anyone who would contribute to such a list, and that's why you have to have a multitude of contributors, so that collectively they hit all the things that they hit all those areas of knowledge that other people making lists don't have. So I would love to be involved, and I'd love to see a new list.
Yeah. It'd be a fascinating exercise for sure. Well, I guess related, I mean, you're doing your own list, sort of, in that you're now writing on your Substack about comics. I'll let you explain what it is. So what are you doing on your Substack?
Basically, a friend of mine here in Houston started last fall to make a series of very short Substack entries about favorite artworks from Museum of Fine Arts, the local big art museum in Houston. Mm-hmm. And I liked it because she's using it to talk about something she grew up with. It was a personal list. So that was in my mind. Then Tandon came out, and I thought very much about the short essays I wrote back when it originally came out, and I really liked doing them. And I like my friend Rainey's list of artworks from Museum of Fine Arts. That inspired me to do the same thing. Rainey had really tight constraints on herself. She each item she would only write 100 words, and consequently would not have any biographical or anything like that information. So it was very poetic. Sure. And that seems like a good way to approach it for artsiness, but I wanted to write it like a regular review, where I'm giving you some of the information that you would need to understand it, and also something about why it's important to me. And then but in order for it to be personal, these are all important books for me from my library. I don't rank them or anything.
Mm-hmm.
I just went around my list of books behind me and went through and said, oh yeah, this one. And I wrote down the names and got it up to about 100 and started writing. That's it. It's
Yeah.
just a chance for me to revisit my library, and it's eye-opening because many of these books I haven't read in decades, and I'm a different person, and lots has happened in the world since then, and I can see that reflected in the books. The books are themselves different books because they're being read at a different time.
Yeah. Do you have any of your obviously your opinions or thoughts might change, as you said, you're a different person, but has there been anything that you've done so far where you think, wow, that book wasn't as good as I remembered, or the opposite, it's a better book than I remembered?
The opposite. When I read Persepolis by Mark James Sartrapi, when it came out in English back in around 2000, and I was very impressed. But rereading it now, I'm much more impressed. It's a much deeper book than I thought, and it's deeply involved in Iranian history in a way that I wasn't aware of back in 2000, because I was a less knowledgeable person about history back then.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, in other words, the work is exactly the same as it was before, but my understanding of it is much better now. And consequently, it feels like a better work.
Yeah. How many have you at this point?
I'm on my 11th.
Okay.
I started at Hicksville.
Mm-hmm.
It'll be number 11.
Nice. Yeah, it's a fascinating exercise to do. Reminds me a little bit of, I can't remember if he numbered them or not, but the Anthony Burgess book, 99 books, or is it 99 novels? He basically picks 99 novels post-war fiction. I can't remember if they're all UK centric or not. It's been a long time since I've read that book, but as a reader, I really enjoyed that. This, very good novelist writing about other people's work in this sort of critical way, but books that meant a lot to him. And I don't think they're numbered. I don't think he ranks them. I think he just picks 99 and goes for it. And it's a similar exercise to what you're doing. And so, yeah, I hope people check this out and follow along with you, because it'll add up to a very substantial amount of writing too on your part.
Yeah. This kind of writing is pretty easy for me to do, but I do try to think hard about what I'm writing, and I try to understand how I personally have changed since the first time I read a particular work, and also how the work's relationship to the world has changed. I mean, for instance, one of the books I read was Journey, and Journey by William Messner Loebs feels totally different reading it 30 years after I originally read it, because you kind of start to realize that William Messner Loebs was a young guy back then, and he didn't have full control over what he was doing. And so he wanted to be part of the team that he was on, the Renegade Comics team. So he had totally inappropriate crossovers with Renegade Comics titles like Neil the Horse or Normal Man,
Yeah.
which hurt his comic a lot, even though I think Journey was a great comic.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so it's when you read, when I read them as they came out, I probably thought, oh, I don't understand why he did this, but I'm okay with it because I'm on Team Renegade too. But 30 years later, you think, oh, that was a mistake.
Yeah.
That's part of the pleasure of doing this, is that you realize the reality of reading it then is very, very different than it is now.
Yeah. I don't want to. I don't want you to offer up any spoilers, but do you have any idea what the most recent book that you chose is?
Yeah, actually, I think I do. Hold on just a sec. Okay, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I'm not. Okay, here's my list. And it might be Simon Hanselman's Crisis Zone might
All
be
right.
the most recent one, but I'm not sure.
Interesting. Yeah, I'll be very interested to see what you write about that book. Um, I'm a big admirer of that book. So, um, well, Robert, is there anything else? Is there any scores you want to settle?
Yeah, Sam, part two.
praises? Any praises you want to sing? Anything else you want to say?
I just want to say that my fellow list makers from the best comics of the century list, I love them all. They're all great people.
Mhm.
They all did great work and continue to do great work. I'm friends with them still.
That's
And
great.
I want to also say thank you for producing this. It
Thank you.
made me feel like I hadn't wasted my time 25 years ago when I contributed to the original list.
Yeah, you definitely did not, and I appreciate it very much. It was a real thrill to me every time someone responded. You know, in the beginning I wondered how many people are even gonna give me the time of day here. So as each one built, it was I don't know. I was very thrilled to even have the access to all of you guys and um, to get to spend the time working on this thing.
Yeah, part of the problem is that when we were doing it, no one was thinking about, hey, we should remember how this came together and what we did at this step. Here's a list, let's go.
Yeah,
As soon as it's done, it's easy to like move on and forget about it.
for
But thank
sure.
you for letting us not forget about it.
I appreciate it. Well, I guess we'll call it there. I really appreciate you coming on and talking to me, and
My pleasure.
hopefully this conversation will encourage more people to um, not just check out my zine. That's one thing, but go get an online subscription to the journal and check out this issue. Um, it's a it's quite an achievement and deserves to be remembered. And as you said, a lot of publishing decisions, a lot of opinions after the fact. I think you can not necessarily trace back directly to that issue, but it certainly informed a lot of things, and I think had more of an impact than would have been given a credit for at the time. So,
Absolutely. And I think that is perhaps the most important conclusion to reach from this magazine is that list really changed comic history in a way. It
all right.
sounds almost egotistical to say, but it did.
No, I think you're right. I think you're right. All right, that's a good place to end it. A great mic drop quote. So, thank you, Robert. I appreciate your time.
Quite welcome. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.